We have to get to the bottom of these issues. That's why we've called him in. And it's not up to the Attorney General to tell the committee how to conduct its business, or we will decide what the most effective way of asking questions are, and that's what our decision is. We've told him we expect him to show up on Thursday, and we're going to conduct the inquiry as we've said we would. If he doesn't show up on Thursday, we'll have to go to subpoenas.
House Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler on Attorney General Bill Barr's threats to bail on his Thursday hearing because Democrats now want the committee's lawyers to ask him questions, too. With me for opening arguments is former Solicitor General Neil Katyal, who actually wrote the special counsel rules, and he's now an MSNBC analyst. All right, Neil, if you're Bill Barr, risk management is the business that you are in. And while it might be the right thing to do to take questions from lawyers, if you don't have to, why put yourself at risk?
Stephanie, first of all, it's great to be here with you tonight in Southern Ferrari. It's awesome to see you. And look, I think the basic thing is you're the Attorney General of the United States. Your job is to uphold the rule of law, to provide information to Congress. And it's like Bill Barr woke up today and or a few days ago when he decided to not testify before Congress and say, like, you know, I'm jealous about President Trump being the coward in chief. I want to wrestle that title away from him. I mean, this is not the way attorneys general behave. It's not the way cabinet members behave. It's not even the way private citizens behave. Just think about Christine Blasey Ford's testimony last year before Congress, in which she did, for hour after hour, answer questions from from committee staff and not from the members of Congress. So, you know, what Barr is doing here is cowardly, and it's also deeply undemocratic. Okay, but that's a subjective assessment. And while I might agree with you, Democrats can't traffic in subjective. They have to ask, but they have to demand that Bill Barr do what he's legally obligated to do. And if he's legally not obligated to do this, are Democrats' only other option is to subpoena him? Because that's a game they don't want to play either. So two things. Number one is I think he is legally obligated. And we have cabinet secretary after cabinet secretary that testified. So you can go look at Iran-Contra, where the Attorney General Meese testified and where Secretary of State Schultz testified. You can look back at Watergate, where CIA Director Schlesinger testified. You can look at the Whitewater hearings in which Michael Chertoff led these witnesses. And when I say testified, I mean testified and answered questions by committee staff, not by members of Congress. In all of these circumstances, committee staff led these. And so I think if Nadler goes to court, he will undoubtedly win. And I also think if Congress wants, they have other options available to them. For example, the House of Representatives can defund the office of the Attorney General, cut Barr's funding, cut his staff's funding. Look, if these people are not going to play by the way that the Justice Department has traditionally operated in this country, if they're going to hide the truth from the American people, then I think all of these options should be on the table. I mean, Bill Barr is not acting like the Attorney General of the United States. He's acting like the coward general of the United States. Damn. All right, let's turn to the Supreme Court. Last week, President Trump tweeted this: "If the partisan Dems ever tried to impeach, I would first head to the U.S. Supreme Court." Help me understand this. Why would the Supreme Court have any role in impeachment? It doesn't. And the Supreme Court's been very clear. There's a precedent called Nixon versus United States, which says quite clearly, we, the Supreme Court, have no role in impeachment. So President Trump can try, I guess, and go to the Supreme Court. I think he would lose 9-0. But I think the deeper point is the way in which he's talking about the Supreme Court, as if it's his court. And his Justice Department acts that way and tries to rush things to the Supreme Court, blows off the lower courts. There's a whole culture around this White House when it comes to the Supreme Court and lower courts, which we've never seen in our lifetimes. It's a very dangerous and corrosive thing. President Trump learned the hard way that there are three separate but equal branches of the government. The judges don't work for him. Congress doesn't work for him. Does he believe that the Supreme Court justices work for him, specifically because two of them got their seats on his watch? I mean, the genius of our founders was to provide life tenure so precisely so that the Supreme Court justices could rule against the person who appointed them. I had the privilege of being Elena Kagan's deputy, and when the health care case came up before the Obamacare case, she ruled against President Obama on a key piece of it. So, and that's a long tradition. It goes back, to our founding of justices doing that. And so I think it's absolutely wrong for the president to think that the Supreme Court is in his pocket, particularly on something like impeachment. I mean, there is no sitting justice who would even entertain these arguments that he's trying to advance in that tweet.
I need a little Supreme Court education. I know you argued a case this month. What happens now? Give me the technicals. How do the judges come to a decision? What goes on behind closed doors?
Yeah, the cool thing about the Supreme Court is actually is the one institution of government that works. Everything, too. But so after you go and argue the case, the justices will meet in a conference. And, it's a very collegial group of people. They all shake each other's hands, and that's a lot of handshakes. I can't do the math, but it's like 9 factorial or something. You're the Wall Street person, you can do it, but it's a lot of handshakes. And then afterwards, they go and discuss the case, and they do it in order of seniority. Nobody can speak twice until everyone speaks once, and then they have a respectful debate and dialogue, and then afterwards, people are assigned to write opinions, a justice in the majority. If there's a dissent, a justice in dissent. And then they go back and forth with the drafts. They share everything with each other. They're not trying to hide the ball or trying to have any log rolling or anything like that. All 9 are just simply going in and saying, what's the best answer? How can I cast a vote that's the best reading of the Constitution and our laws?
Respect, decency, civility. That's what we like. I wish that was contagious in Washington. Neil, thank you so much.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.